You are listening to the Bat Flip Podcast, a baseball podcast from Belly Up Sports and the Belly Up Podcast Network. Here are your hosts, Damian and Matt.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Bat Flip Podcast. My name is Damian here with co-host Matt, coming to you on August 2nd of 2022. Got a trade deadline episode today. Sorry for missing last week. Matt and I were not able to line up on a time, but it's going to be a super long episode, so buckle in for this one. And then before I go to Matt, we actually have David back on, which he's been on for a couple episodes before. So how you doing, David?
I'm doing good. Trying to start my new job here and, balancing out watching this trade deadline unfold, which it was pretty crazy today. So, probably one of the best players in baseball moving teams over to the Padres. So I'm excited to dive into that and, what some teams did and some teams didn't do. So Matt, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. Sorry about last week. I was on vacation. I was actually on a boat while we were supposed to be recording. So, but it's been a crazy deadline, like David said. It's been a lot of fun to keep up with, and there's been some head scratchers. There's been some enormous moves, and there's been some head scratching moves on teams not selling too. Rockies, but we're gonna get into it here just a second.
Yeah, so we broke this down by division. So we'll go ahead and start in the American League East, and we'll start with the Yankees, who were one of the more active teams on the deadline this year. And the first trade that we have for them is that they traded Jordan Montgomery to the St. Louis Cardinals, acquiring center fielder Harrison Bader and player to be named later, or cash.
Yeah, so starting off with this one, Jordan Montgomery has been a pretty solid pitcher this year. It has a 3.69 ERA and 114 innings. His peripherals back that up very well, and he's a solid mid-rotation arm for a team that go into a team that really needed mid-rotation arms because outside of Wainwright and Mikolas has had a really good year. They were really lacking behind those two guys, and now they've added in Jordan Montgomery and Quintana, who we'll get to later. But they brought in Harrison Bader to New York, who they've been playing Judge in center field a lot, and they'd like to save his legs by putting him back in his natural position in right field. So it makes a lot of sense to bring in Bader, who's an elite defensive center fielder. Has swung the bat pretty well at times too. Last year, 110 WRC plus. Year before last, 114. So this year's been a little bit down, but he's also dealt with some injuries. He is coming back soon. So a good insurance policy for the Yankees, and also Aaron Hicks has played a lot of center field too, and you just never know what you might get with him health wise. So definitely a good move, really a win-win move there, because the Yankees went from their depth of starting pitching, and the Cardinals were able to fill a big need, and they have depth in the outfield. So.
Absolutely. So the next trade that we had from the New York Yankees was acquiring relief pitcher Scott Effross from the Chicago Cubs for Hayden Wesneski. So David, what do you, since you're a Cubs fan, what do you know about Scott Effross?
So Scott Effross was generally my favorite pitcher of the season so far, man. He's a sidewinder, throws a lot like Steve Cishek. If you just kind of have a visual in your head, he was sitting on a 218 FIP this year and a 28% strikeout rate with a 6% walk rate. The guy was been featured on Pitching Ninja a bunch. So if you had an eye on that account, you'll have seen Scott Effross a bunch. This is the Cubs jumping on the capitalizing of a value, and this is the kind of trade that they have not done in years. I can't even remember the last time they capitalized on someone's value like this. Effross having an amazing season, the Yankees picking up an amazing reliever, and the Cubs are going to get a starting pitching prospect in Wisniewski that has a good slider. He's good fastball up in the mid-90s. He was up in the top 10 in the Yankees prospects lists. From what I saw, he's going to be about the 8th best prospect on the Cubs, and probably their 2nd or 3rd best pitching prospect right now. So just a really good pickup for them. And I think the Cubs did a good job here, even though I don't like giving up Scott Effross like that. He has 5 years of control. If he's good for 5 years, this one might look bad down the road and look really good for the Yankees. But overall, yeah, definitely a win-win, A+ grade on both of these acquisitions.
Yeah, just a quick comment on that from my end. you never know when a reliever like a Scott Efros, who was never a really highly touted prospect, every now and then one will turn out to be Steve Cishek or Darren O'Day or somebody that's around a long time. But for every one of those, you have a guy like Dan Winkler or Richard Rodriguez that like has one insanely good season or half season and then just completely falls off. Relievers are very volatile, and the Cubs cashing in on it, may or may not have been a great move. It's just kind of a wait and see on that.
Yeah, so another one, we'll jump to the next Yankees move that they did was acquiring Frankie Montas and Lou Trevino from the Oakland A's for Ken Waldachuk, Luis Medina, J.P. Sears, Cooper Bowman, another starting pitcher for the Yankees, and another reliever to help fill that bullpen role.
Yeah, I'll start off with the guys that the Yankees got here. Frankie Montas has been really really good over the last two seasons. 2021 had a 4.1 wins above replacement. Pitched in 187 innings with a 3.37 ERA, backed up well by peripherals. 2022 he's been just as good, a 3.18 ERA. He's really been better. 104 innings. The one little blip on the radar was that a couple weeks ago he got pulled from a start or missed the start because of some shoulder tightness, and but he did come back from that and pitch pretty well in his outings. After the injury, so I think that might have lessened the return just a little bit. But they also got Lou Trevino in this trade, who at times has been a really good reliever. I think that the Yankees definitely made a point to improve their bullpen. And Lou Trevino this year is really weird. He's got a 6.47 ERA, but his peripherals are really, really good. So we'll see if maybe change of scenery, better defense behind him could help him out some.
Yeah, and then the next move that the Yankees did, which was kind of the move that kind of kicked off all of trade deadline season last week, was acquiring outfielder Andrew Benintendi from the Kansas City Royals for right-handed pitcher Beck Way, left-handed pitcher TJ Sikkema, and right-handed pitcher Chandler Champlin.
Yeah, I'll jump on this one. Andrew Benintendi's, Red Sox World Series hero back in 2018, and ended up being traded to the Royals in this last offseason after a pretty big slump, and he's rebounded. He's got a 387 on base percentage, a 124 WRC plus. He's been worth 2 wins above replacement so far, and the Yankees are looking for like a leadoff hitter, somebody that can kind of set the table for Aaron Judge, who's got 42 homers already. So Benintendi's the perfect kind of guy, sitting on 11% walk rate, that can just set the table for Judge in front of him and get on base, but for those home runs to become from solo home runs to 2-run home runs. TJ Sikkema is probably the best prospect there, but this is a rental trade, so I think the prospect capital the Yankees give up here is pretty negligible. They just went and got their leadoff hitter, and that's what they were going for. You're going to see Benintendi in the playoffs, I think, making some impact for the Yankees.
Yeah, and just on the Yankees trade deadline as a whole, I think they're one of the big winners. They didn't give up any of their top prospects. They didn't give up Peraza. They didn't give up Volpe. They didn't give up Jason Dominguez. They did give up a couple of their top pitching prospects, but they got like Frankie Montas, who was one of the top 2 starting pitchers on the market. They brought in a reliever who looks to be really, really good, and Efros. They got a new center fielder, and they got Benintendi, who is one of the better outfield bats on the market, without really giving up one of their top guys. So I think it was a pretty big win for the Yankees on this deadline.
Yeah, and then staying kind of with the Royals, since we talked with Benintendi being traded, they ended up trading, or jump over to the Toronto Blue Jays now. They traded Whit Merrifield to the Toronto Blue Jays for 2 prospects by the name of Samad Taylor and Max Castillo.
Yeah, so Whit Merrifield has been having a very mediocre season this year. He's a guy who's been on the trade in trade talks for like 3 or 4 years in a row now, and really the Royals should have traded him when his value was kind of at its peak back in like 2019, 2018, somewhere in there. But this year it's been pretty rough for him. There are some signs that he may be a little bit better than his numbers are showing. He's only got a 266 BABIP, which is his career low by a wide margin. And his plate discipline numbers aren't any worse or than they have been in the past. The fact is his walk rate's up a lot over the last 3 years, so that's something that's good to see. But he's a guy who's going to be a good utility player, can play a lot of different positions. George Springer's dealing with some injury, so that he could help their outfield some. And he also steals a lot of bases. He had 15 stolen bases this year already, so definitely a good base runner. He's kind of a good utility bench player at this point in his career, who could be a league average hitter, defender, and a good base runner. So I think it's a pretty good move for the Blue Jays without giving up a ton of capital.
Yeah, and then the Blue Jays continued their trade deadline by acquiring Anthony Bass and Zach Pop, with a player to be named later from Miami for shortstop prospect Jordan Groshans. And then also along that, we'll just to wrap up Toronto's, they acquired Mitch White and Alex DeJesus from the Dodgers for Nick Frasso and Moises Brito.
Yeah, so this I think is the Blue Jays being a contender for winning their division, even if they can catch the Yankees. But at the very least, they'll be the strongest AL wildcard team, I think, without a question, with this reliever group that they've acquired here. White should be able to start from the Dodgers. He's pretty good. And Damien, you might even be able to speak on White a little bit better. Anthony Bass played for the Cubs in like 2018. He was very good, and they let him go, which was a little weird. But he's made a career down in Miami, making saves. He's been a really good ground ball pitcher. But this year's walk rate's down. ERA's at 1.4, and he's been one of the most effective relievers in baseball. And he might have even been the best reliever traded at the deadline. Efros was probably close there with Bass. Zach Pop's been just as good for the Marlins and maybe a little less time, but he's another ground ball heavy kind of pitcher that can fit into their bullpen really well. And they only give up Jordan Groshans and Nick Frasso, who are valuable prospects, but they're probably not superstar level players. And so, if you're Toronto, you kept Tiedemann, you kept Gabriel Moreno, you kept a lot of those big, heavy hitting prospects that you could use later on. I think this is a fantastic deadline for Toronto, and they can really set up because they didn't give up anything of note, and their offense is already insane. So, the rotation's a little bit bolstered with White. The bullpen's great. Toronto gets like probably an A- for me. I mean, they didn't pick up any heavy hitters, but they did a really good job.
Yeah, to piggyback on the Toronto thing, I think a lot of people were a little surprised they traded Groshans, but I don't think they realized that Groshans really struggled in the upper minors after being he's still a top 100 prospect on a couple of sites, but his value's been dropping really quickly. So it might be one of those scenarios where they were able to sell, get pieces for him while they can before he just ends up being like a quadruple A player or something. So I think it was a good deadline for Toronto for sure.
Yeah, and then just with going to Mitch White, a player comp that's pretty easy is coming from the Dodgers to the Blue Jays is Ross Stripling, kind of swing man type 5 in a rotation, fastball, slider, curveball guy. He's going to be pretty solid, probably outperformed all his stuff so far this year. So just kind of be a solid arm for them to have in there, some depth, since they battled some pitching injuries to start with. But moving over, we're going to go to the Boston Red Sox, and this one happened because it's a more of a deal that we're going to talk about later, and this was kind of a fallout from it. But Boston is acquiring first baseman Eric Hosmer, outfielder Max Ferguson, outfielder Corey Rozier, and $44 million from the San Diego Padres, which is the entire Eric Hosmer contract for prospect Jay Groom.
Yeah, this was a really, really weird trade because you're getting if you're Boston or if you're the Padres, why are you if you're selling the $44 million and Hosmer, you're paying his entire contract, you know, you're you're giving up prospects too, like Max Ferguson and Corey Rozier. I don't think those are like crazy good prospects or anything, but it's weird. And Jay Groom's a guy that he was a former first round pick, by the and a guy that when he was picked, he was considered the top prospect in that draft, although he ended up being picked like 13th or 14th because of slot values and how the major league draft goes. But his value really hasn't been as high. He's drafted way back in 2016, and he's 23 years old now. He is at AAA, so you're getting a guy who is a upper minors, been around a long time. Um, if you're the Padres, and then Hosmer is just kind of a slightly above replacement level first baseman, which honestly might be better than what the Red Sox had. I mean, Dahlbeck and Franchi Cordero haven't exactly been setting the world on fire at first base for the Red Sox, so they might have upgraded a tiny bit at first, even though Hosmer's not very good anymore. And San Diego paying the entire contract. I was a little bit surprised by that because I felt like they would probably they were probably going to try to offload some of that deal to help stay below the luxury tax, but it sounds like that didn't happen. So it was definitely a weird trade. But I think it honestly made the Red Sox a tiny bit better because, like I say, Dahlbeck and Cordero aren't exactly setting the world on fire at first. So
I I will speak real quick on why the Padres wanted to get rid of a Hosmer contract and trading a prospect for that. Um, you're right that the Red Sox definitely need a, a first baseman right now that can field because those guys are really terrible fielders. But what the Padres have been trying to do is attach prospects to get rid of those, get rid of that money. And what they're going to run into was that they got forced into this. And we'll talk about it later when we get to San
yeah,
Diego. But they got forced into this. And so the prospects they could give up were a lot worse than back when they were discussing with the Cubs to trade Hosmer and like Robert Hassel, who I believe went in the Juan Soto trade.
he did.
For just taking on the contract. They were trying to attach a prospect to get rid of Hosmer's contract. So that's the idea is when you have so much prospect capital like the Padres did, they just wanted to use it to get rid of Hosmer. Well, then now they just gave it away without giving up that prospect capital. And the Boston's just trying to take advantage of that where, Boston can afford a guy like Eric Hosmer.
Absolutely. So the last trade for this division, it's a much smaller than all of these ones, but the Tampa Bay Rays acquired David Peralta from Arizona for catching prospect Christian Serta.
So David Peralta for the Rays or for the Diamondbacks was having a pretty good year. He's been an above league average hitter. He's been a roughly league average fielder. His numbers are real similar to what they've been his entire career: 248 average, 315 on base, 457 slugging. He's hit 12 home runs. He's just a really good outfield bat, corner outfielder. Does everything decently. He's not a crazy good player. He's definitely a platoon splits guy. He's gonna hit really well against right-handed pitching, which the Rays always seem to do well with platoon splits guy mixing and matching. That's kind of their thing. So David Peralta get moved there. Definitely a good move for Tampa Bay to grab him, and then they gave up a catching prospect in Christian Serta. So and Christian Serta is the number 45 prospect now for the Diamondbacks. Who, granted, their farm system's extremely deep, but David Peralta wasn't gonna fetch a ton of return, and Christian Serta, he's put up good numbers in the early on in his career at the complex league and stuff, but it's not not really a crazy return there. So a good move for Tampa Bay.
Yeah, so that will do it for the American League East as far as them acquiring the best players in each of the deals. Now jumping over to the American League Central, which is pretty much this whole conversation is just going to be about the Minnesota Twins making deals. We talked about the Royals trading off, the Tigers traded off one guy, White Sox didn't do really anything, and neither did the Guardians. So Minnesota acquired, I guess we'll just run down them all and we can just talk about it in one thing. Minnesota acquired Michael Fulmer from Detroit for Sawyer Gibson-Long. Then they acquired Jorge Lopez from Baltimore for Cade Povich, Juan Rojas, Yenner Cano, and Juan Nunez. And then they acquired Tyler Mahle from the Cincinnati Reds for Spencer Steer, Steve Hajar, and Christian Encarnacion Strand.
So my favorite prospect that the Twins gave up here was Christian Encarnacion Strand, Tyler Mahle kind of looks like a controlled starter star. Kind of, I expected him to get a similar return to Frankie Matas or Luis Castillo, just because he's one of those FIP darlings that tends to underperform his peripherals and strike out a lot of guys, not walk a lot of guys, just ends up giving up some extra home runs because he plays in Cincinnati. So I was kind of expecting Mahle to get a little more, but I think what we see in this trade specifically, because I think it's the most important trade, is that Encarnacion Strand is kind of getting viewed right now by the industry as a really, really good prospect. And I think Steer and Hajar also are really good prospects. Those were guys that, in my research of looking at what the Cubs should go after, those were guys I wanted the Cubs to go after. They have really, really good numbers in the minor leagues. Encarnacion Strand's a third baseman right now who's got like a 160 WRC plus in Double A as a 20-year-old. Like he might be a superstar level player. But that's the kind of risky player, because he may not stay at third base, that the Cincinnati Reds are equipped to take on right now and give time to develop. as for the Twins, I mean, they pick up their starter. They pick up Jorge Lopez, who was probably the most underrated player at the deadline. I think he probably could have fetched a lot more and probably was more valuable to the Orioles to the rest of the year. The Orioles are like 2 games out of the wild card right now, and so we're going to get into the AL West here in a little bit and talk about another Orioles player getting traded. But it doesn't make any sense for the Orioles to be selling right now, but they were anyway. And they pick up 4 prospects for Lopez, which is maybe a similar deal to the Cubs and Efros, capitalizing on that value where Jorge Lopez kind of came out of nowhere this year to be a really effective closer for them. And maybe the Twins have solved their closer problem finally.
Yeah, I'll piggyback off of that. It definitely. Michael Fulmer and Jorge Lopez are going to help this bullpen a lot. Both have really good numbers so far this year. Jorge Lopez, he's been a legit turnaround. Fulmer, he's got some good peripherals, but it seems like his home run per fly ball rate is really, 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 really low. So I think that maybe being out of Comerica, he might give up some more home runs. But the Twins, it's kind of like we were talking about earlier. They gave up some interesting prospects, guys who like Encarnacion Strand, who maybe are underrated by services. But, at the end of the day, like the Twins didn't give up they didn't give up anybody that's currently rated in any top 100s. They paid a price, obviously, for what they gave up. But they didn't give up Austin Martin. They didn't give up Royce Lewis. They didn't give up Jose Miranda, Winder Balazovic. They could have given up some of these guys and they didn't. So definitely, definitely a good trade deadline for the Twins. They got a lot better. I was kind of surprised while we talk about the Central that the White Sox didn't make some kind of move. I think a lot of their moves are going to be improvement from guys get back from injury, but still, they're definitely a couple places they could have upgraded, and then Cleveland, they really did nothing. So, it feels like the Twins were really the only one going for it at this deadline, which makes sense because you never know what might happen with Correa at the end of the season. But definitely like what the Twins did here, and I think they got a lot better.
Yeah, and there's just one big thing before we move over. The only one out of those that you're not going to have past this season is Fulmer. He's the only free agent.
Yep.
Lopez and Mahle, you both at least have under control for next season. So I think that's a couple big things for them as well. But going over to the American League West now, we had the Houston Astros making a couple trades here, acquiring Christian Vasquez from from Boston Red Sox for Emmanuel Valdez and Weiler Abreu, and then they acquired Trey Mancini, Jaden Murphy from Baltimore for Seth Johnson and Chase McDermott. That also was a 3-team deal with Tampa Bay getting Jose Siri from Houston.
Yeah, so I'll start with Christian Vasquez. Christian Vasquez is having a really, really good season was for the Red Sox. Now he'll be for the Astros. They really needed a catcher because Martin Maldonado just can't cut it anymore as a catcher. He's still fine defensively, but he's so bad offensively. It's really struggling. And then Jason Castro just doesn't have it anymore either. But Christian Vasquez was having a really good year, 111 WRC plus. He's always been a fantastic defensive catcher. So you're getting a really, really good player in him if you're Houston. They didn't have to give up an awful lot for him. So I think that they definitely made a good deal there with that acquisition because it kind of fills a hole in the Houston lineup that they really needed, and they didn't give up a ton for him. They didn't give up any kind of like major overpay or anything like that. So definitely a good trade there for Houston.
I will say that I think it's an absolute crime that the Orioles traded Trey Mancini, coming off of coming back from missing a season 2020 with testicular cancer. He's been back at it, and he's been hitting just as well last year and then this year as he was before. Maybe not quite as good, but this year he's certainly shown he's cut the strikeout rate a little bit. Walk rate's the same. On-base percentage is up. Slugging's a little bit down. So I think with Houston, someone said that Trey Mancini's the perfect hitter for the Crawford boxes, where Baltimore moved the fence back in left field and kind of did the opposite of what Houston has right now, and it's hurt Trey Mancini's power because he keeps flying out to deep left, and those would be home runs in the Crawford boxes. He'd have like 22 home runs already in Houston. So I think this is a really good move for Houston, but it's just the not the best move for the Baltimore Orioles, who once again trade away a really good player, maybe a franchise icon.
Yeah, I think that, and also on that, Jose Siri getting traded to the Houston Astros had a bunch of center fielders that are all kind of the same, and I think Jose Siri is going to end up being like a Tampa Bay type player, so that might end up being a kind of underrated acquisition for Tampa Bay. But I think if Baltimore was going to trade Mancini, they really needed to get a huge amount of return, and I think they really did for a guy like Mancini. He's a rental guy, and he's a first base slash DH type player, and he's only got a 751 OPS. And I don't like the Orioles trading him, but they got back a couple of a top 15 prospect from the Houston organization, or that's now a top 15 for Baltimore, and then they got back another kind of interesting prospect. So they did get back a decent amount for a rental, DH first base type who's got a 750 OPS. So I mean, I kind of hate it in one way, obviously because of the Trey Mancini being kind of the heart and soul of Baltimore while they've gone through their rebuild and they're finally starting get back in the race just a little bit, and then trading Mancini. But if you're gonna trade him, and I think the way Baltimore looked at it, if we're gonna trade him, we better get a pretty good haul for a guy like this, and I think they did. But it still sucks to see him get moved.
Yeah, Mancini's a guy that I could totally see re-signing with Baltimore after the season
Yeah.
because he's a free agent. I could see them doing, hey, we're going to get something for you, and then in the offseason we'll talk about having you back, because he did truly seem broken up about having to leave Baltimore. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's a guy in the offseason we're talking about re-signing back in Baltimore. But staying in the American League West and jumping over to the Seattle Mariners, and they made probably the second biggest splash, maybe third biggest splash of the deadline. Really, the first big blockbuster trade we had was acquiring starting pitcher Luis Castillo from Cincinnati for shortstop prospects Novelli Marte, Edwin Arroyo, right-handed pitcher Levi Stout, and pitcher Andrew Moore.
Yeah, this was a massive deal, and it kicked off the kind of these teams who are willing to go for it are willing to go for it. I did not think Noel V. Marte was going to be going this deadline unless the Mariners splashed on Juan Soto. So the Reds do an incredible job here getting a really good prospect. Marte is one of those guys who was kind of sneaking around the top 10 of prospects in baseball. High speed guy, a lot of steals, a lot of power too, and high A this year. He had 15 homers, 13 steals, 134 WRC plus, and this guy is 20 years old. So, you're looking at maybe a future guy at the level of, Carlos Correa, Corey Seager, 4 or 5 wins above replacement per year. And that's tough to reason giving up for a year and a half of a starting pitcher. But the Seattle Mariners are on the longest playoff drought of any team since 2001. They have not made the playoffs, and that's the longest of any team in baseball. So you got to get your guy. And if Luis Castillo is the starting pitcher that leads him to the promised land, then so be it. And Noel V. Marte is a light price to pay.
Yeah, and I'll talk about this one as well because it's such a big trade. But the fact that you get, um, the fact that you get, Edwin Arroyo as well in this deal. If you're Cincinnati, you got to be thrilled with the return you got. Luis Castillo is really, really good. He's having a great year. He's got a longer track record than some of the other starters that got moved. Like, he's got a much longer track record than Tyler Mahle for sure, and he's got a longer track record than Frankie Montas. That's probably why he's fetched such a much larger return. But you look at Edwin Arroyo as a 18-year-old in A ball and full season ball has got a 132 WRC plus. He's hitting 316 with a 385 on base, a 514 slug. Some teams are a little bit worried about his athleticism playing as it goes forward. Fangraphs only put a 40 on his hit tool, but still, like, this is a guy who's some people are rising up into their top 100 on prospect boards, and as David said, you get Noel V. Marte, which is shocking. I think that it probably would have been close to a fair deal if it was just Noel V. Marte for Luis Castillo, and then you throw in a guy who some people are putting up as in the top 5 of their system. Plus, Stout, I think, is a guy who some people are definitely high on, thinking that is a potential, a pretty high rated guy too. So definitely an interesting trade here. I think that you look at Seattle though, and I mean they had to do something to address their pitching. They've been really lucky in their pitching staff this year, so bringing on a guy like Luis Castillo, they can now run out Robbie Ray, Luis Castillo, and Logan Gilbert and George Kirby, and their front four. That's a really good rotation. So they've gone from a mediocre rotation to start the year to a really good one at this point. So definitely good move there.
Can't forget Marco Gonzalez either. He's been in Seattle
Yeah.
forever, and he's deserving of a playoff start at some point here. So they've
Oh
got
yeah.
a fearsome fivesome down, up there in Seattle, and man, I hope they make the playoffs and make a World Series run. That'll be cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that team's going to be fun, and I think at least on my end, from getting Luis Castillo, I think it was something that kind of an underrated need for them because Kirby's going to hit an innings limit at some
Yep.
point, so you want to be able to get off him a little bit. Logan Gilbert's probably going to hit some sort of an innings wall as well, and you want to make sure he's as fresh as possible for the postseason as well. And you've been riding Robbie Ray like the horse that you paid him to be, but it'd be nice to have another guy to where you can maybe back off him later in the year. Just a little bit instead of making him go 7, maybe he can just go 5. But getting a guy like Luis Castillo's caliber in there is going to help that team quite a lot. But that's going to wrap up our American League side of the trade deadline so far. So let's jump over to the National League East side, and we're going to start in Philadelphia, who were probably one of the more underrated active teams. Even with some small moves, they acquired David Robertson from the Chicago Cubs for pitcher Ben Brown. Then they acquired outfielder Brandon Marsh from the Angels for Logan O'Hoppe. They acquired Edmundo Sosa from the St. Louis Cardinals for left-handed pitcher Jojo Romero. And then their big move is acquiring Noah Syndergaard from the Angels for Mickey Moniak and Jadiel Sanchez.
Yeah, I'll jump on David Robertson as the resident Cubs fan. He pitched superbly this season as the Cubs closer, and he was extremely reliable to the point that his cutter has been biting more this year, and he spoke about it actually today in an interview and said that his elbow feels the best it's ever felt coming off of surgery. Which is, I think, kind of huge. And I think down the stretch, he's really going to help the Phillies in the bullpen. I mean, as for the Cubs, you knew they were going to have to trade David Robertson. He was 37. They signed him to a 1-year deal. They got half a season of really good performance from him. Had him, throwing that cutter a ton, throwing the big curveball a ton, and that pitch usage change, coupled with the extra movement from his arm feeling healthy for the first time in years, has catapulted his value up a ton. He was really effective going down the up until the deadline here, and the Cubs were trying to rest off of him so that they could preserve his kind of sub-2 ERA. But I like the pitcher they got. Big guy, 6'6", power sinker, AA, 22. The perfect little lottery ticket for a guy like David Robertson. And I don't think the Phillies are. They got Painter, they kept Abel, even through those bigger trades. But in terms of the Robertson deal, I think the Cubs win, the Phillies win. Good deal for all, and Phillies are looking to make that playoff push.
Yeah, I'll talk about Brandon Marsh a little bit. This was a really weird trade because Brandon Marsh just got. I mean, he's a second-year player for the Angels, who obviously are in need of guys who are going to be there a long time since they're, not winning this year and they may or may not be rebuilding. Who knows what they end up doing? But but he's a guy that he had a high prospect pedigree. In fact, when he graduated from prospect lists last year, he was the number 11 overall prospect for Fangraphs in the whole league. But at the same time, he's also a boom bust prospect, or he was, and he had a high strikeout rates in the minor leagues for the most part, like upper 20s in the minors, which is pretty high. His walk rates were pretty good, but he's a guy who, since he's been in the big leagues, is the worry with him and his hit tool and his approach at the plate's really come to fruition. He's really struggled to hit big league pitching in his first, roughly full season of ball. A 35% strikeout rate last year, 36% this year. He's not walking as much. He's running an 80 WRC plus. He is a good defender in center field, so the Phillies definitely needed some help defensively, and that is something they're going to get through Brandon Marsh. Is just good defense in center field, but definitely a guy that could or could not be good. And then Logan O'Hoppe is a guy who he's blocked in Philly because of Real Muto being there, so it makes sense for them to want to move him. But I think they probably could have gotten a better piece moving him. He has been an absolute insane hitter in the minor leagues, and at Double A in 2022 has a 139 WRC plus as a catcher who's a pretty decent. I think most people expect him to stick behind the plate. So and at only 22 years old. So this is a guy you're really stinks for the Phillies to have to give him up for somebody like Brandon Marsh, who he's under control, but how good is he going to be? So it seems like he might be one of those like Victor Robles types who ends up being a good base runner defender, but just never handles big league pitching. But we'll see. Definitely a risky trade from both ends here, but and one of the more interesting ones today. So.
Yeah, and then the Phillies acquiring Edmundo Sosa. I mean, we've talked time and time again on this podcast that the Phillies defense has been one of the worst defenses in the history of baseball, especially on the infield. And they acquire a defensive first player that can play all three, up the middle and then third base, and give you good defense there. He's not going to be much of an offensive player, but as long as they get some sort of a defense in there, they don't give up much. They give up left-handed pitcher Jojo Romero, who had kind of struggled with them, really didn't have a spot, and so it's pretty much an even trade there. The Cardinals get a pitching prospect that they can try and throw in their bullpen, and the Phillies get some sort of resemblance of defense on their roster.
Yeah, and then I'll speak on Noah Syndergaard. Velocity's down this year, which off of multiple arm injuries is definitely a little bit concerning, but he's really remaking himself into more of a sinker pitcher that can get those ground ball outs, carrying that low ERA and then the higher FIP this year. So, making a trade for Syndergaard, and he's got a high salary too. That 1 year, $21 million deal with the Angels made him kind of a rental for them, and he's looking to go into free agency this year and sign that multi-year deal, to prove that he can pitch without injury. The Angels were never going to get much for Noah Syndergaard just because of that big salary. But the Phillies definitely looking for that starter that can kind of step into their number 3 spot behind Nola and Wheeler. And I think Syndergaard really fits that mold nicely since he's become that sinker ball guy. I just hope that he doesn't end up sacrificing a lot of runs just because of that defense behind him. Hopefully Edmundo Sosa can kind of make that difference there at shortstop, and then they can maybe slide Didi Gregorius to second and improve that defense just a little bit. They keep running Nick Castellanos out there in the outfield. Kyle Schwarber's out in the outfield too, and those guys, one of those guys needs to be a DH every day, and they've had multiple games this year where both of them are in the outfield. So it's just they haven't been optimizing their massive offense lineup, and I hope that Brandon Marsh and Edmundo Sosa can kind of provide that for Noah Syndergaard here, in terms of and the Angels just unloaded the pitcher for as much as they could, which I believe was Mickey Moniak. So Moniak will probably get a chance to play some outfield in Los Angeles and maybe remake his career with a fresh start somewhere other than Philly, where he's kind of viewed as a bust.
Yeah, I wanna mention with Moniak, this is a guy that obviously he was the number 1 overall pick several years ago. He was a cost-saving number 1 pick, but I want to mention he has been really good in the minor leagues this year so far. There was a lot of swing changes. I remember them talking about he had a great spring training, and then he got injured early in the season and went back down to the minor leagues. He's been really good. He's got a 125 WRC plus at AAA, so I think that he was a legit value for the Angels to get to at least try him out with a change of scenery, give him some regular playing time and see if he can figure some things out at the big league level. And then Yadiel Sanchez, watch out for him because he's the type of guy. He's 21. He's in complex ball, but he's a switch hitter. He's got some traits. So that's the type of guy sometimes you just got to watch out for. But Mickey Moniak was an interesting guy for to be put in this trade from the for the Angels to get. So I'll be kind of on the lookout to see how he does there.
Yeah, it's going to be pretty interesting to see the long-term effects of both of those kind of Brandon Marsh and Mickey Moniak deals. But jumping over to the New York Mets now, a couple moves that I didn't even have on here was they acquired Daniel Vogelbach, Tyler Naquin, and then Michael Givens. I don't really have the returns off the top of my head, but Vogelbach will be the DH for them against right-handers most of the time. Givens will be an impact arm in that bullpen. David will be able to talk to him about him because he was on the Cubs. And then Naquin's kind of just a fourth outfielder, another lefty bat for them. But kind of the other side of that DH platoon that the Mets acquired today was Darren Ruff from the San Francisco Giants, with trading J.D. Davis. I'm not even going to try to announce the next guy's name, Thomas something, and then Nick Swack and Carson Seymour.
Yeah, so I'll talk about the Darren Ruff trade first. This was a really weird move to me because kind of off the top of my head, they just traded Darren Ruff, who is a fine player, platoon bat, outfielder, for J.D. Davis, who is a fine player, platoon bat, outfielder. Could play first base, play a couple different infield spots. But I mean, to me, like there's really no difference between these two players. They're exactly the same. I mean, they have very similar peripherals. I mean, I think that there's really not any difference. I mean, Ruff has a 105 WRC plus, JD Davis has a 102 WRC plus, and really the big difference is the fact that JD Davis is not a free agent until 2025, while Ruff is a free agent. Well, he's signed through next year only, and with a club option in 2024. But Ruff is also 36 years old compared to Davis being 29, and the Mets give up prospects to make this swap. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. And the guys that were not super high rated prospects, but they were real prospects. I mean, Zapuki's been in the big league some. And Zwack was on their top 30. So I thought that was a really strange trade for me, and I don't really understand it from the Mets' point of view.
I get it though. I understand where it is. Is this was the Wilson Contreras package, and the Cubs were not willing to take this.
Yeah.
That's what I believe is that there was mentioned that the Mets and the Cubs had some JD Davis talks. I think it was back in June, and this makes some sense that it would have been a Wilson Contreras deal that the Cubs didn't want to take on because they didn't like JD Davis or for whatever reason, and so the Mets just turned and found the nearest partner that was willing to give them a DH for this package.
Yeah, and I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think you can give the same package for Darren Ruff as you do for a guy like Wilson Contreras, but I don't know. This was a weird one for me. So
Yeah, and there were some rumors about them also being interested in trading Dom Smith, and we didn't see that go anywhere either. So that's going to be something that we can, look forward in the future. But I'm just glad Matt told me how to say Zapuki now,
I think
so
that's
I
how you
can.
name Zapuki,
Hey,
something.
hey, we're gonna roll with it. But let's stay in the American League East, and we'll jump over to your Atlanta Braves now, who made a kind of a flurry of moves the night before the deadline, and then one big move at the end of the deadline. But they acquired Jake Odorizzi from Houston for left-handed reliever Will Smith. They acquire switch hitting outfielder Robbie Grossman from Detroit for Chris England. And then at the buzzer, they acquire Rysel Iglesias from the Angels for Jesse Chavez and Tucker Davidson.
Yeah, and I'll go through these real quick. There's not huge moves, but Jake Odorizzi has been decent this year, but he struggled. He dealt with some injuries. He actually had a weird Achilles injury that ended up not being a tear or a break when a lot of people thought he might be out for the year after suffering it. But he's come back and he's looked okay. He's kind of a number 5 starter / long reliever type guy, kind of a spot starter swingman. The Braves really needed that. They've got some guys, kind of like we were talking about with the Mariners. They got a couple guys with Strider and Wright who are kind of approaching the most they've ever thrown innings wise. So kind of getting another guy, maybe go to a 6-man rotation for a little while could help. And they got rid of Will Smith, who's been absolutely atrociously bad this year. And really, didn't really understand this move from Houston at all, except the fact that Houston actually had no lefties in their bullpen. So I guess they had to get a lefty of some kind, and the money kind of worked out with these two guys. They have similar, Will Smith's a free agent after this year. Odorizzi is not, but Odorizzi's owed. They're basically owed roughly the same amount of money over the rest of their deals. So, you look at Robbie Grossman coming to Atlanta. A guy who's really struggled this year, but he hits lefties really well. And the Braves have Eddie Rosario playing left field, who's a left-handed hitter. So I think that's just a straight up platoon right there. Another thing that was kind of interesting to me is that Marcell Ozuna has reverse splits too. He's been DHing for Atlanta, so maybe throwing Grossman up out there when you face a lefty could make sense too. Chris England really wasn't a real prospect. He's like a way down the line, maybe could be a reliever type guy. And then the big one, Raisel Iglesias for Jesse Chavez and Tucker Davidson. Jesse Chavez had been really, really good for Atlanta, but I kind of get it with him. His stuff's not good. It might have been a little bit of smoke and mirrors how good he'd been this year. Tucker Davidson is kind of that quadruple A type pitcher that is kind of blocked. I don't really think he's got a huge future, and it makes sense for the Los Angeles to take him on because he's a guy who they could throw right into their rotation and maybe have something there. He was a pretty good prospect, and Braves getting Raisel Iglesias. One note is they are paying his full salary, which to me I'm a little bit worried about the fact that they're paying his full salary because I don't know how good a value they're going to get there. But, just what it does for the team, I think he's a good reliever. His peripherals are still really, really good, even though his ERA has been a little bit higher this year. So I think he's going to slot in perfectly. Him, Kenley Jansen, and Kirby Yates being your, three right-handed relievers that's really nasty. So I thought Atlanta did a pretty good job, given the fact that they only have one top 100 prospect in their entire farm system. So.
Yeah, and then I think what this also does is it gives you some insurance in the offseason going in with, if Kenley doesn't decide to come back or whatever, you kind of have a closer locked in at that point because Iglesias can slide over to that role pretty easily, and especially for the contract he's getting paid there. But jumping over to the National League Central, not many moves from here really, but the Milwaukee Brewers acquire Matt Bush from the Texas Rangers for Mark Mathias and Antone Kelly. And then the St. Louis Cardinals acquired Jose Quintana and Chris Stratton from Pittsburgh for Johan Oviedo and Malcolm Nunez.
I know it was a couple days ago, but the Brewers traded Josh Hader to the Padres.
Yeah,
David,
we'll get into that.
David.
We'll get into that when we talk about the Padres.
Still, I mean, that's a big trade in the NL Central because they still went for something. Whatever. The rest of the moves are weird, and I think the NL Central's moves are punctuated by the lack of moves. The Cardinals did not trade for Juan Soto, and the Cubs did not trade Wilson Contreras or Ian Happ. And those are significant to me, more so even than the trades that didn't happen. The Cardinals had more, I think, a better package to give the Padres or rather the Nationals than the Padres did. And they didn't give them. They were clearly unwilling to part with Dylan Carlson and Jordan Walker, and I feel like that was a no-brainer. Those, if you just package those two and then maybe some lesser prospects, they probably get the deal done. And then the Cardinals have Juan Soto, Paul Goldschmidt, and Nolan Arenado in the middle of the lineup. The fact that they weren't willing to get to that point, it's just shocking to me. But it's nice as a Cubs fan, obviously. But I can't fathom why the Cardinals wouldn't have done that trade. And I think that Carlson's probably more valuable than any of the prospects that San Diego provided right now. But he's not even close to Juan Soto's value. So it's one of those things that you improve so mightily in left field if you're the Cardinals that you instantly become the division favorite. I don't see why now you're banking on Jose Quintana to save your season. But the Cubs keeping Contreras after he's been very emotional about leaving the Cubs and he's slumped in July. This has been a distraction for him, and now he's being kept to potentially lose money in the free agency pool. This is maybe a strange move, I think, but the Cubs have been clear that they did not like the offers that were provided for Contreras, and maybe we oversold his value as a bat and maybe a catcher half the time in the middle of the season as an acquisition. So I certainly don't hate keeping Contreras, but now the Cubs need to extend him, I think, is the clear next step, because you can't really just go give him a qualifying offer because I think he'll take it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I thought that. I mean, trading for one thing, Ian Happ is kind of one of those guys. It's like it's not that big of a deal. If you didn't like what you're going to get for him, you're going to have him next year. So I didn't think that was the end of the world if they weren't blown away by an offer. But with Contreras, I mean, obviously the Cubs did not think that whatever they were going to get for Contreras was worth that they thought they could do better with a comp pick in the draft than what they would have gotten for Contreras, or they can be in the same situation, trade him next year at the deadline, or have him next year if they're competing. So, I mean, I don't fully understand. I would have traded him, but I get it to a certain level. You look at You look at Matt Bush, talk about the guys who did get traded. Matt Bush, he's having a really good year was for Texas. He'll be good in Milwaukee. One thing Milwaukee needed to do, and we'll get into the Josh Hader trade in a few minutes, but they did need to get a little more deep in their bullpen because they really only had two really good guys there. So Matt Bush helps the depth in that bullpen. And then you look at St. Louis as a guy who is, um, a Jose Quintana is a guy who he struggled for the last couple of years, and but he's pitching really well this year. He's always been a guy. It's kind of interesting to think about. He's always been a guy that suppressed the home run ball and has run really low home run per fly ball rates, and I think it makes a lot of sense to me that the fact that his value he stopped being an elite pitcher in 2017 after he got traded. That was the first year of the real juiced ball era, and this year we're back to not juiced ball, and he's back to being really good. I think the juiced ball probably hurt him worse than any other pitcher, and
You might be right about that.
yeah, and it kind of goes to show because he's always been a guy who limits who limits the quality contact, limits the home run ball. He always runs really low home run per fly ball rates, and I remember reading back in when he was at the White Sox them talking about how it was really weird how he was able to do it because it wasn't like he's like a 60% ground ball guy. It wasn't like he was striking out 10 guys per 9 innings, but he just never gave up home runs. So I think that probably had a little bit to do with him, but he's been really good this year. So you look at that, and then Pittsburgh got a pretty good haul for him. Johan Oviedo is a guy who was pretty highly thought of as a prospect. He's been in the big leagues some now. He's 20. It's 2022. He made his debut in 2020, so he hasn't been especially good in the big leagues. He might be damaged goods at this point, but it's a little bit like last year with the Bryce Wilson trade. When they acquired Bryce Wilson, maybe they can reclaim him, and if not, it's not like it's going to wreck your season. So definitely interesting guy for them to get back there.
And good on the Pirates for keeping Brian Reynolds, by the way.
Yeah, for sure.
Another guy who does not need to be moved right now. The Pirates are on the way up. Got a bunch of prospects hitting the majors. Got to keep some of these veterans around who've been there a long time. So they traded Vogelbach. They traded Quintana. That's it. You stem the flow there, and you keep bringing guys up that can affect your play in the future. So overall, NL Central pretty quiet except for the Brewers.
Yep.
Absolutely. So let's jump over to the National League West now, where we had the Los Angeles Dodgers acquire Joey Gallo from the New York Yankees for Clayton Beeter, and then acquire Chris Martin from the Cubs for utility guy Zach McKinstry.
Yeah, I'll talk about Joey Gallo first, so David can get to with the Cubs trade. But Joey Gallo is a guy who I've never been a huge fan of. Joey Gallo. I know a lot of people like him, and by numbers, he's been pretty valuable. Last year, 4.4 wins above replacement, but there's something to me about a guy who's striking out 38% of the time that just and also has a bad batting average. He doesn't get good, doesn't do well on balls in play either. He really is just a home run or bust guy, and I think for one thing, the non-juiced ball, let's talk about with Quintana. I think it's hurt Joey Gallo a lot, but he's definitely got some issues. I will say that with him, I think the Yankees, being with the Yankees and being in that environment in New York really hurt him. I think that he had a lot of issues with the fans there and stuff, so that he might be better not in New York, but he's definitely a guy that it's interesting for the Dodgers. They probably could use him in a corner outfield. They've been playing Jake Lamb out there some. Trace Thompson's playing a lot in the outfield. They could definitely upgrade, and if you can fix Joey Gallo, then you could have something there. I don't especially love giving up a real prospect for him at this stage in Clayton Beeter, but Clayton Beeter is also a guy who's walking tons of guys at Double-A, so he's really a high risk, high reward type prospect. It's not like he's some surefire talent. So definitely an interesting trade there, and it probably does help the Dodgers the rest of the season. So.
Yeah, and Beeter, just to jump on that, sorry, David. Beeter is probably more likely going to be a bullpen arm at some point, anyways. And Gallo will at least give them some sort of better defense out in the outfield over a Jake Lamb, and they weren't giving much offensive production, anyways. So little easy way there. But David, what about the Chris Martin for Zach McKinstry deal?
Yeah, so This is my favorite trade the Cubs made. I think pretty easily. Chris Martin is, and Matt can attest, a World Series capable pitcher. He was in the World Series last year, pitched well, and this year brought 95-mile-an-hour sinker to the Cubs. He gave up a few extra homers than he had been in years past, but I really don't think that that's indicative of anything moving forward. He could very well step over to the Dodgers and throw scoreless innings the rest of the way. And this is a typical guy that got forced out in Zach McKinstry, where in order to facilitate the rest of that lineup where you have Gavin Lux and you have Trey Turner and you have all these guys, Zach McKinstry doesn't have any room to play Major League Baseball, and that's where he needs to play right now to develop. So just a typical reclamation a little bit by the Cubs to try to grab a guy who can play second base, shortstop, all the outfield positions. Great utility player, the kind of guy that you want on the bench on a competitive team. And maybe he can step into being a starter and cut that strikeout rate in the major leagues, because in the minors his strikeout rate tends to sit at like 15 to 20%. Majors it's up at 30%. So if the Cubs can tweak something in his approach, maybe the sequencing of his pitches and when he attacks pitches, maybe he'll get a little aggressive, to try to change the trajectory of his career. Then they can at least get a high quality utility player who may not be an above average offensive contributor, but at the end of the day, if they can get the guy who hits for 115 to 120 WRC plus in the minor leagues, that's an absolute steal on their end. But the Dodgers won't feel that because he got forced out. There's a lot of talent above him. So great job of picking a guy that can help them right now. And with Nick Madrigal kind of being hurt and in and out of the lineup, and ineffective when he wasn't there, and then you've got a lot of playing time the rest of the way here for some of these guys, young guys, to get a chance. This is the perfect spot to jump on a guy like Zach McKinstry for the Cubs.
Yeah, I agree with you, David. I think that was a good move for the Cubs, and Chris Martin is a guy who, I mean, he's so weird. Last year he quit striking people out. It was weird, and this year he's back to striking people out. So, if he can keep that up, I think the home runs will come down. He's a high home run per fly ball rate. He's probably adjusted a little bit. Last year, a lot of Braves fans, as he was on the Braves, were talking about how they thought he might have been a sticky stuff ban, you know, guy who was really hurt by that, but maybe he's made his adjustments to figure that back out now. So we'll see what ends up happening with Chris Martin. As David and I were talking about before the show, he's just going to take innings away from Reyes Miranda, so it's not like it's some kind of awful thing. And McKinstry was totally blocked in LA, so there was no place for him there. So you might as well ship him off and get a reliever who's got some upside. So definitely an interesting trade there, but I think it works for both teams.
Yeah, it does, and like you mentioned, it's just going to be a middle relief guy to go into that bullpen. But we'll move over to the real winners of the trade deadline here, and that's with the San Diego Padres making two blockbuster trades. The first one is acquiring Juan Soto and Josh Bell from the Washington Nationals for Luke Voigt, Mackenzie Gore, C.J. Abrams, Robert Hassel, James Wood, and Harlan Susana.
I think we're both going to have a lot of thoughts on this one. I'll go ahead and start. I mean, it's hard to even find a place to start on this. Juan Soto, 23 years old. Everyone knows about him. He's one of the best players in the game. In all likelihood, he's going to be a future Hall of Famer. He's having a down year this year, but he's still been like a 151 WRC plus in a down year. He's going to be insane. He's projected by the projection systems to have a 174, which is like Trout level hitting. Projected. Now, I will say that his defense and base running are horrible, which is something that long term maybe affects him. If he had good base running and defense, he'd be the best player ever. But that doesn't really make him not good. But he's insane. And then Josh Bell being thrown in here too. I mean, Josh Bell is a guy who, he's been really good this year. He's been up and down throughout his career. First baseman / DH type guy. Obviously at 142 WRC plus is a career high for him. He's done this before. He had a really hot start in 2019. His track record's been a little bit of inconsistency, but Definitely a good pickup when you're playing Eric Hosmer at first base every day. So, but the big question is everyone knew that this was gonna. Everyone knows this is a great move for the Padres when it comes to their team. But I think the big question mark going into this was what's the return going to look like? And honestly, I really don't think the return's quite as much as I was kind of expecting. I do think that the Nationals got some guys who are probably undervalued by prospect lists in the industry. I think that like James Wood is a guy who's probably more of like a top 50, top 40 type prospect. The way he's played in A ball this year than he is a um, 66th overall prospect type guy. Robert Hassel the third is a really really good looking prospect at high A center fielder. It's gonna be top. He's a top 40 guy. CJ Abrams is very interesting. I think that we might David and I from what we talked about earlier have a little disagreement on CJ Abrams. I'm not super. I think he's good. I think he's a really solid prospect, but I think he's really risky. I'm not super high on him, but I think he could work out. And then Mackenzie Gore being a guy who's been in the big leagues a lot this year, he's another guy that his prospect pedigree is really really good, but he's had some inconsistency at times. So I am a little bit worried about him being a star, but at the same time he's got such high upside. I think the Nationals definitely went for upside in this deal, and I do think that it was a little bit of an underpay from the Padres. I think the Padres definitely didn't have to give up too much for this compared to when you start talking about it being Juan Soto, but definitely an interesting trade and one of the biggest blockbusters we've seen in a long time.
Someone on Twitter said it perfectly earlier, and I want to try to paraphrase. This is the Miguel Cabrera trade
Yeah.
from the Marlins to the Tigers from about 2009. Miguel Cabrera at that point was a superstar, but he was kind of, flailing away in Miami. Traded to the Tigers, won 2 MVPs, went absolutely insane, Hall of Fame career, and so you look at this with Juan Soto, and I can't believe this was all it took. I really thought the Padres were going to have to give up, you know, their two other top prospects, probably Campusano and Merrill, or at least Morejon, who's their kind of top remaining pitching prospect. Those guys aren't stars or anything, but it's just that extra value. And then I can't believe that they got the Nationals to throw in Josh Bell either. But when I went and pulled it up because I was curious, and let me read you Juan Soto's stats since 2020. Started 2020 to now. 296 batting average, 449 on base percentage, 542 slugging, 418 WOBA, 165 WRC plus, 14% strikeout rate, 21.5% walk rate, 63 homers, 21 stolen bases, 212 runs scored. He scored the same number of runs as Mookie Betts, who is a famously, a good base runner, guy who's going to get around the bases a lot faster. That's absolutely crazy to me. Juan Soto is kind of a one-man wrecking machine in left field, and he's going to be a Hall of Famer. Matt already said it. I think he came up at 19, right? He's younger than some of the prospects he just got traded for. I think he's younger than Mackenzie Gore. I can't believe the Nationals traded him at this point. You can't trade away a Hall of Famer this good, this young, right? He's got 2.5 years left. This is the Nationals owners. This is at their directive because they're going to sell the team. They want the team to have a clear direction of tanking and then moving forward at towards the future for the new owners to be able to step in and have. This is the perfect place for any team to jump in and acquire a Hall of Famer to go ahead and supplant their World Series run, and that's what the Padres have done right here. You have to call them the World Series favorites at this point, but it's like they're not even leading the division, right? The Dodgers are leading the division. This team is not even complete. Juan Soto is going to go in here and bat with around Manny Machado and Fernando Tatis. This is a absolute juggernaut of a team, and they're not in first place yet. So the Padres have spent all this currency. AJ Preller has gone off the deep end, going for this, and I love it. But I cannot believe some other team didn't want to try to beat this. Even a team like, teams that are tanking, like the Orioles or the Cubs or the Pirates, these teams with big prospects, they could pay this. Extend Juan Soto and then, build your team from there, because apparently all it took was 5 or 6 pretty good prospects.
Yeah, and I wonder, based on the way that things sounded about Juan Soto, I wonder he turned down the $400-something million extension, which I do think is the AAV on it was really low. But I wonder if he would have signed any deal, because as long as he was with Washington, they were going to be bad for like the next 5 years, regardless of whether Juan Soto was there or not. I wonder if he basically told Washington, "I'm not signing any extension here," because I want to go win. I wonder if that maybe had something to do with it too. But yeah, I mean, if you're Washington, I mean, I feel like, for one thing, I feel like you could definitely have gotten this package in the off season. I think it maybe even better, because other teams would have gotten involved. Right now it's just contenders getting involved, because teams that aren't contending don't want to pay for three pennant races when they're only going to be involved in two. But I mean, this is a return that I would have expected from with 2 years of control. So it'll be interesting. Now that we kind of getting out of the way the trade too. Maybe um, it'll be interesting to see what if the Padres are able to lock him up long term. I think that's kind of the next big thing. Or if the Padres gonna, I mean, they're gonna be spending well over $1 billion on 3 players if they do, which is pretty insane. But I mean, for the 3 players that it would be, it might be worth it. So,
Yeah.
Here's what I saw. Oh, go ahead, Damien.
I was going to say, so jumping in on it, as far as the extension talks with Juan Soto, as far as that part, Scott Boras has, because he's a Boras client, had come out and said that he wasn't signing an extension until the new ownership was in place with Washington, at least. And the new ownership, whoever that's going to be, I guess they wanted Juan Soto gone beforehand. So that's kind of what happened there. It comes to a point where I feel like AJ Preller, I mean, we've talked about him. He went off the deep end here, and you just mentioned the payroll flexibility. If they're going to be able to have enough to re-sign him, it feels like they've really pigeonholed themselves into this 2.5-year run with Soto, because they don't have any prospects left. Their pitching isn't the greatest. I mean, I know they re-signed Musgrove to an extension, but Darvish is getting older there. You just traded Gore. I mean, Clevenger's going to be having to get re-signed soon. I mean, you don't have a clear pitching, staff behind that coming up. And, are you going to be able to commit that much money to the 3 people? Because we've seen them not be the willingness to go into the luxury tax threshold like a team like the Dodgers have been willing to do. So that's going to be interesting to see what happens here in the next couple of years, because I feel like they've really pushed their chips in for 2.5 years of, hey, we're going for it, and then after that, we don't really know where we're at after that.
The explanation I saw, and I don't remember if it was Passan or one of the main baseball writers, but they said that the idea was to go for the World Series this year and next year, and then evaluate in that offseason, the 2023 offseason, whether or not they could trade Soto for maybe a lesser return, but a similar, echelon of prospects, 1 or 2 guys, and then, recoup value in their system that way. And I think that may be a brilliant strategy if they can do that, right? And you're absolutely giving, let's say you just get exactly back, James Wood and CJ Abrams, for example. You are absolutely giving up those 4 prospects for the year and a half of Juan Soto, right? So
yeah.
they are focused, I think, fully on the first this year and next year, and then whether or not they trade Juan Soto after that will be, 2023 offseason's problem. They're not focused on an extension. They're just going to go in and try to win the World Series in 2022 and 2023. And, bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, and that screams what AJ Preller's done in the past too. I mean, he has repeatedly thrown his chips in on one season and hoped that it went well, And I think this season he's made better moves this season to do it with Juan Soto, and we'll talk about Josh Hader in a minute, but I think that this is definitely. I think that definitely could be the case, and of course, they might also look at a lot of things can change in just a couple of years too. So Juan Soto, he might love being in San Diego, and they might do so well and then they might re-sign him, in this offseason. He also might. He's a guy that what if it's one player? What if he gets hurt? Then you might not get anything back for him and let him walk. And maybe the Padres lose a bunch of their talent and are struggle next year even with their top couple guys, and then they decide to trade him like you're talking about. So I think there's a lot of moving pieces, and I don't think this is a situation like with the Matt Olson deal earlier this season or something where a guy's going to get like an immediate contract extension. Though I think it probably will be this at least in the offseason this year. So
Yeah, I'm not even sure it's going to be at that point.
yeah,
Um,
it might not be, but
it like I said,
it's down
it
the
really
road.
does feel like it's going to be the 2.5 year thing and kind of play it out for that part. But we're going to stay with the Padres. I mean, we might jump into the Soto conversation in another episode, but staying with the Padres, they also did acquire Brandon Drury from the Cincinnati Reds for shortstop prospect Victor Acosta. And then the other move that we've been talking about, the San Diego Padres acquired Josh Hader from the Milwaukee Brewers for relief pitcher Taylor Rogers, Denilson Lamet, and two prospects, Yastru Ruiz and Robert Gasser.
Yeah, so I'll jump on the Drury one first. I mean, Drury is a guy who kind of an interesting one too. But he's having a really good season. But he has no track record of success, and he's a rental. So the Reds definitely 100% going to trade him, and they got an interesting prospect. Victor Acosta is a guy who has pretty good numbers in the minor leagues. He crushed the Dominican Summer League last year at age 17, 2022. Has been decent in complex ball in 32 games, about a league average hitter. He's a top number 12 prospect in the Padres organization. So he was definitely a guy who was, at least interesting. And when you're trading Brandon Drury, who is a career below average to average-ish hitter and doesn't give you a lot of defensive value, doesn't give you a lot of base running value, who's just having a really hot start to or first half of his season this year in Cincinnati. you know, eh, I don't think you're I don't think you're really overpaying. And the only thing about it was I think it's kind of weird because I mean the Brandon Drury's mostly an infielder. I know he can play some outfield, but he's really played mostly second and third base through his career. And I mean, you got Manny Machado at third, and you got Jake Cronenworth playing second. So, and you also have Tatis coming back potentially, probably playing outfield this year, but maybe playing short. And then you got Ha-Seong Kim playing short. So you just got a logjam there, and it's kind of weird to grab Brandon Drury for this team. But I mean, at the same time, Brandon Drury's been really good, so I mean, you can't fault him too much for it.
I might call this the biggest overpay in the deadline, which is saying something. I think we've seen it's this or Luis Castillo for Noelvi Marte plus.
Yeah.
But Drury is having one of those years where I don't know how much of that is Great American Ballpark. I kind of expected him to fetch less. Acosta's kind of a decent prospect, should be a major league player at some point. So, that's a bit of a questionable call. But hey, how about the Reds? I mean, they picked up a ton of prospects in this deadline. I think there are a bunch of them are shortstop prospects, which is kind of funny. But to jump to the Hader deal, they swap Taylor Rogers and Josh Hader. Both of them had stretches this year where they were really good. Both of them had stretches this year where they were extremely bad. Josh Hader had like a 12 ERA in July. So I look, at this trade as a change of scenery for Hader, but I don't really know what the Brewers are doing because Rogers is kind of an identical situation to Hader, and it ends up being a kind of almost a one-for-one swap to the point that it's going to affect the teams this year. The Brewers are going to have to make their playoff push with Devin Williams as the closer instead of Hader, and then they'll move Rogers probably to the setup man. But, Hader's going to close for the Padres, and he's going to be pitching those big innings in the playoffs. And the thing about Hader is he either strikes you out or he gives up a home run, it seems like. So I wonder if we won't see maybe a late home run in the playoffs off of Josh Hader because of this. And I don't know if he was maybe the right acquisition in the bullpen for the Padres. I think I like, guys like Efros and guys like Jorge Lopez a little bit more in terms of being effective relievers for less cost than having to give up, Rogers, and you're picking up Hader's salary and the stigma of you have to start, put Hader in that closer spot within the ninth inning to get the saves. I just don't know if that was the right move if you want to win in the playoffs right here. Given that the Braves' kind of model of winning in the playoffs last year was have two piggybacking 4 inning guys. The Padres don't really have that. They're more of a traditional team. I wonder if that's going to hurt them in the playoffs.
Well, I think my big problem just with this trade, sorry, Matt, to cut you off there, but you pick up Hader, you have the extra year of control for sure, but the closer role wasn't your issue. And you might have slightly upgraded it with between Rodgers and Hader, but the rest of the bridge to that closer's role was the issue, and you didn't really do anything to solve that. You just brought in Hader to, I guess, lock down the save situations, which was already happening with Rodgers, and you gave up the closer. You gave up another potential bullpen arm that you kind of were using there, and then Gasser, who a lot of people seem to like more than prospect lists actually do. That people are saying he could be a legit, back end of the rotation pitcher there. I mean, and you didn't help solve the bridge between your starting rotation and that closer's role, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. This screamed to me a Preller type deal that we've seen a million times, where he goes after a big name, and that is probably a little bit over. He overpays for it. I mean, we've seen it so many times. We saw it back when he traded Yasmani Grandal for Matt Kemp. I mean, in his first year or so, traded for Justin Upton. I mean, traded Max Fried for Justin Upton. I mean, you've seen it a million times from Preller, and it seems to blow up in his face most of the time. I don't know if this one will. He might be able to get away with this one, but it just doesn't make a ton of sense. But at the same time, I mean, Josh Hader definitely got a longer track record and is a little bit better than Taylor Rogers. I mean, you probably save a tiny bit of money this year because of Dinelson Lamet moving, which it just feels like Dinelson Lamet's a guy that the Milwaukee's going to figure out how to make him into a really good reliever too. But I don't know. It's kind of a weird trade for me. I mean, I guess it makes sense from the standpoint of, I don't think they're very worried about Hader, his last month. I mean, look at his track record of over his entire career, and then look at the last month. I don't think it's that big of a deal, but definitely a guy who, I definitely think they probably got a little bit better in the bullpen, but, I think that at the same time, I don't know if it was really worth paying 2 prospects and a major league pitcher to make up the difference between Taylor Rogers and Josh Hader. So definitely kind of weird, but
yeah, and I do look at Milwaukee now, and you see a hole in the back end of their bullpen. It's filled by Devin Williams. Obviously, at the closer spot, he can step in. He's been stepping in with Hader struggling. He steps in when Hader's out, but Devin Williams was really strong in the 8th inning to set Hader up, and they were kind of a thunder and lightning from the right and left side. Now you're sitting on Taylor Rogers, who's not nearly as reliable as Hader. I think this negatively affects Milwaukee's playoff chances, and it positively impacts St. Louis's playoff chances in the NL Central, because I don't think either of those teams are going to be good enough to win the wild card. The Phillies making all those additions, I think the Phillies are going to probably be able to stay in front of whoever's second in the NL Central, and so then you look at the Cubs didn't get worse, the Pirates didn't get a lot worse, so those teams are going to be decently competitive, whereas we've seen before, like the Reds are going to be pretty disastrous. But their division didn't get a whole lot worse than it already was, and they already didn't have very many wins. So whoever loses out between the Brewers and the Cardinals is not in the playoffs. And the Brewers get worse in the bullpen right here. They Matt Bush comes in, but I don't feel like Matt Bush is going to offset the loss of Josh Hader and the attitude that would kind of give, where instead of adding at the deadline as a contender, you're subtracting and kind of supplanting. It screams to me that the Brewers are not making the right moves here, and that's where I kind of lament again against the Cardinals. Why would you not go and get that kill shot of Juan Soto to fully embrace that ability to jump ahead? There was rumors of the Cardinals going after Pablo Lopez. They didn't do that. The Cardinals missed an opportunity here, I think, to put the Brewers away, because the Brewers look like they're struggling and not really having a direction right now. I think this is a missed opportunity by both teams, really, because why were the Brewers doing this when they need to be out there adding, trying to get in the playoffs right here? Because all you got to do is get in. Was last year we saw the Braves were one of the last teams in, and they won the World Series. The Nationals won the World Series like 4 years ago from the wild card. It's going to be kind of a crapshoot once you get there. Obviously, you want the better players, but the Brewers are not doing anything to get better in the playoffs here, and not doing anything to get to the playoffs even.
So a couple things off that. So you mentioned the Nationals winning the World Series. It's kind of funny because the year they did that, all three players from the infamous wild card game moment are on the Padres now, with Trent Grisham, Juan Soto, and Josh Hader are all on the Padres now as teammates.
Yeah.
But at least from Milwaukee's side, I mean, yes, you lost Josh Hader, but in all, I think you overall improved the depth of your bullpen at that area. Like the gap between as a closer strictly, because I believe Devin Williams will probably still stay in the eighth inning. They'll probably use Rogers as the ninth inning guy, or they'll do it based on the matchup between those two. I mean, Rogers has been pretty good this year as well, and he has a pretty good history of being a back end of the bullpen type guy. You didn't really lose that much of a gap there, and you were able to bring in Matt Bush and Dinelson Lamet. That if you're able to fill out or to figure out what Dinelson Lamet needs as to be a shutdown reliever there, you could improve the overall depth of your bullpen while not sacrificing so much as at just the closer's role itself.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think it ends up after the moves kind of a wash for the Brewers. I don't really think they got better. I don't really think they got much worse. It kind of just depends on what you think of Taylor Rogers. I mean, I don't think he's as good as Josh Hader, but he's not like a bad closer. He's a good closer. If Josh Hader's people think he's top 5 closer in the game, then Taylor Rogers is probably somewhere between the 5th and 10th best closer in the game. Although they both had one bad month this year, so I don't know. It just feels like to me this trade just kind of didn't make a ton of sense from either side. But the Brewers obviously wanted to move on from Hader for some reason too. So there was something about Hader that they were like, we got to get him out of here, because it just seems like this trade was kind of a weird one. It's not like they grabbed some big time guy for him. It's kind of like they just kind of slightly downgraded the closer role and maybe grabbed a couple of decent prospects. Like, I don't know, it didn't make a ton of sense to me, but definitely am not ever really a huge fan of the buy sell type thing. So some people like that, but I don't. So
Yeah, well, that wraps up all of the trades that we had. At least I think we talked over 30 trades in just this episode alone. There were plenty more that happened on a much smaller scale that we didn't get to. Maybe as the players play and they have good weeks or something, we might revisit some of that stuff. But overall, before we end this episode, what are your guys' overall thoughts on the trade deadline and the outlooks of this postseason run that we're gonna head off into?
well, I guess I can go ahead and start. I mean, I thought it was a really, really interesting trade deadline. Anytime you end up with the Juan Soto, being involved, that's when it got really interesting, because there was a lot of time there where people were thinking this wasn't going to be that big of a deadline, which outside of Soto, it was really kind of a normal, when it came to like who was being traded type thing. But I thought that there were some good winners and losers. I definitely think the Padres were a big winner. They got Soto. They did give up a lot, but I don't think they gave up what I expected Soto to fetch. And then they got a couple other guys who are really going to help them too. I think the Yankees did a really good job. They really didn't give up that much of anything, other than they gave up a couple pitching prospects, but they didn't give up like any of their top 5 type guys. And they got a lot better with Frankie Montas being kind of the headliner there. I definitely thought there was some bizarre moves by teams not selling. Like, we talked a lot about the Cubs or buying, teams not selling or buying. Like, we talked about the Cubs, but I thought the Red Sox deadline was really bizarre. They kind of bought and sold. We talked about them selling Christian Vasquez, but then they traded for Tommy Pham, was one we didn't really talk about, but they traded for Eric Hosmer, which I thought was just going to be a prospect dump, but it really wasn't because since San Diego was paying all of his money, so that was kind of a weird thing. They traded for Reese McGuire as well, and then you had like the White Sox really didn't do anything. You had you know, it just seemed kind of weird with some of these teams. Like the Rays didn't do a whole lot. Um, and then some teams not selling, like we talked about the Cubs, but the Tigers didn't sell anything other than Robbie Grossman. Like, why did they not trade Andrew Chafin? I mean, that made zero sense to me. Why they didn't trade
Yeah.
Andrew Chafin? He's like the best lefty reliever on the market outside of Hader, and they didn't trade him. Like, I don't understand that at all. Of course, the Tigers are in the predicament they're in for a reason. I mean, I felt like the Royals probably could have sold off a couple other pieces they have, but of course they're the Royals, so you kind of expect them to not do anything smart typically. But like Michael A. Taylor is one. I mean, I don't know why they didn't sell him. Um, but definitely at the end of the day, I think that you look at over the landscape. Oh, and I didn't think the Dodgers really did as much as I thought. I thought they were going to go out and try to get somebody a little bit more um, established in that rotation. So that was kind of interesting to me. They really didn't do much of anything. They just got Joey Gallo on a down year. So but you look at what happened, and I really don't think anybody really moved the needle all that much. The Mets also didn't get anybody really, other than a few kind of DH type guys and a couple of relievers who aren't closers. But you kind of look at like um, I think everyone kind of stood pat for the most part, except for the Padres, and who got a lot better, and everyone else I think just got marginally better. I think the Mariners got a lot better too. Of course, they did overpay for what the amount they got better, but I think that's going to help them a lot in the playoff push. But we'll see what ends up happening. I think it's going to be a really exciting couple months here, and I think this trade deadline sets up a really interesting last couple of months. I'm really glad that I know Damien's going to hate me for saying this, but I'm really glad that Soto went to the Padres because I think I think that's really good for the competition in the league. I think if he goes to the Dodgers, it's just like why even watch it anymore? It's kind of like when Kevin Durant went to the Warriors or something. I think going to the Padres, I think that creates a really good matchup between those two teams. Um, I would have said the same thing if he had gone to the Cardinals, where it kind of creates another really major World Series contender. Because I think right now there's probably, you know, three or four in the National League who are legit World Series contenders between the Dodgers, the Padres, the Mets, the Braves. And then in the American League, I think that I think things are going to heat up. That AL East is pretty wild, and the AL Central is going to be really wild down the stretch. Even though none of those teams really have a shot to be world champions at the end of the day, but I think that division is going to be really interesting down the stretch too. So definitely an interesting trade deadline, and we'll see what ends up happening. But David, what did you think about everything?
So I was decided I was going to give three winners, and three losers. I think that's a good number. I can dump on a couple teams that I don't like what they did, and then approve of a couple of teams. So my number one winner, Padres. We've talked about them in length. I'm not going to go into it. Juan Soto. End of story. Winner number two would be the Mariners. Luis Castillo. We've gone into it. I really want them to make the playoffs. They're doing everything right. I wish they would have supplanted the bullpen a little bit, but I think we're underestimating how good their bullpen is. Paul Sewald is really good, and they've developed a lot of really strong arms there. So the Mariners are going to be one to watch as you go down the stretch. Winner number three, I'm going to go with the Yankees because of Frankie Montas and then Benintendi. I think those were actually the two best possible outcomes for the Yankees. Benintendi setting the table for Judge it just makes so much sense to me. And then Montas, and they obviously got Scott Efros. I love Scott Efros. I think he's going to be a stud in the bullpen. So Yankees are winner number three for sure. In terms of what they give up, it really doesn't matter. They could have given up Volpe and Peraza, gotten these guys, and they still would be winners in my eyes because they got so much good talent at the major league level. The fact that they didn't give up those guys and were only able to only give up Waldichuk and Wisniewski, that's a pretty solid trade deadline for the Yankees because I think those guys are legit MLB starting pitcher guys, but they're not superstars, and they got superstars back, I think. So really strong deadline for the Yankees. My loser teams are the Baltimore Orioles, who are 3 games out of the AL wildcard and are selling. That is absolutely the wrong move. You can't do that. Even if the Baltimore Orioles had just stood pat and kept Trey Mancini and kept Jorge Lopez and missed the playoffs, no one would have questioned it. Everyone would have been fine with it. There's no guarantee that you get multiple lottery picks back to back. You only get it once. Orioles picked high this year. They picked first this year. They've got a ton of prospects. They could have bought light, kept all their top prospects, kept all that currency. They didn't do it. They could have made the playoffs this year. They realistically could have. They wouldn't have won the World Series, but they could have gone in and picked up Tyler Mahle for an interesting player and kind of to lead their rotation. They're getting John Means back next year. Like, they're going to have a team that's decent enough to get into the playoffs. The Orioles can't have done that. They're loser number 1. Loser number 2 is the Guardians. What are they doing? You're watching the Twins get better, and I'll even say the White Sox too. The Guardians and the Twins needed to be active here. They're right there neck and neck with the Twins. The Twins go out and get Mahle. They go out and get Fulmer. They go out and get Lopez. White Sox don't really have anything to do anything. They don't have any currency. Their prospect system is the worst in baseball. The Guardians just didn't do anything. They were pat for nothing. They need another bat probably and just didn't pony up. So those two are they're kind of in the same boat for me. You have a very winnable division. You're not going to win the wild card. Why not go for it here? But they didn't even sell. So it wasn't like they took a direction. It's very aimless, and that's, I think, the wrong call. And then the last loser is the Rays. They have a huge prospect cache, and all you come out with is Jose Siri. Come on, what are you doing? They could have upgraded a catcher, could have traded for Contreras. They could have gone out and picked up another reliever. We know the Rays love their, spinny relievers, and there were plenty of them available. They didn't pick anything up. They simply just didn't go for it, but they didn't sell either. And we've seen that the Rays can shift the direction of the franchise simply by selling. When they picked up Baz and Glasnow in the same trade. So, no direction from the Rays. They're loser number 3. And yeah, that's it for me.
Yeah, one more thing you're talking about the loser. We didn't even mention because they didn't make a trade. What about the Rockies too? They did nothing. Like, they literally did not make a single trade this year. Yeah,
they signed an extension though. The only team that did that, remember?
Yeah, the
horrible
only team. Yeah.
To David, I don't know if you saw that, but did you hear what the Rockies GM said?
No, I didn't.
He said that, they asked him why he didn't make a trade, and he's like, well, we were the only team that signed anybody to an extension. 29 other teams didn't sign anybody to an extension this week. And they were like, well, Austin Riley and Joe Musgrove literally signed extensions this week.
And those guys are a lot better than the 38-year-old reliever. Yeah. You see what a team like the Cubs is doing, where they're capitalizing on reliever value. You see the Orioles capitalizing on controlled reliever value. And you see the Rockies adding control years to a 38-year-old reliever. All right. Good for Daniel Bard to get paid. That's all I got on them. They are a disappointment, and they should probably sell the team.
Yeah, it's just like it, and with the Rockies too, and I'll just make one point on that too. You say they should sell the team. It's hard for me to hate on them so much. You kind of have to, because they're making such dumb moves. But it's weird because they're trying to make good moves, but they're just bad at it. Like, some of these teams are like the Pirates are like penny pinching and stuff. Like, I don't think the Rockies are really penny pinching. I think they're just bad at making good moves. And that's kind of what I hate about it, is that you want to encourage a team to try to do good and improve their team. But man, like, if you're just going to keep signing Chris Bryant to $180 million contracts when they can't stay healthy, like, speaking of which, he went on the IL again. I mean, I don't know. I mean, the Rockies and the Angels at the same level. It's like, it's hard to hate on their ownership because they're putting up the money to try, but they're just bad at it. Like, they can't, So, but anyways, I thought that was crazy that they didn't even make everyone's hating on the Cubs. At least the Cubs traded a couple pieces. Like, the Rockies literally did nothing at all. Like, they could have traded Crone. They could have traded Jose Iglesias. Like, why is he still a Rocky? He's just gonna walk at the end of the year. He had some kind of value. Like, somebody would have taken him on as a utility guy. You might have gotten a back end of the rotation prospect type thing. I mean, it just makes no sense. But
yeah, it doesn't. But I'm sorry, we've went really long on this trade deadline episode. But a lot of activity. We had to hit all into it. We'll hit on some more stuff over the next couple weeks and get into some deeper conversations. But thank you guys for tuning in to this episode of the Bat Flip Podcast, and we'll catch you guys next week.